Chicago Theater Review. I'm Frank, and Gail and Devlin's with us, and we've got a great show lined up for today. And that leads us to our very special guest who has a really great show that's in the planning. I think everybody's going to really enjoy. It's from a wonderful theater company that I enjoy called Red Twist Theater. So Gail, why don't you tell us what's going on?
Okay, this is Greg Kolack, and first of all, Red Twist Theater is, I can't say enough about what a wonderful theater this is, but we're going to talk about what he's doing now, because I'm very intrigued with this, and we had a discussion before we came out here. We're going to start with, first of all, it's the Laramie Project, which for anybody, I mean, everybody knows this story, that back in 1998, Matthew Shepard was found beaten. And then a theater, Tectonic Theater, went in and went to Laramie and interviewed people and came up with the Laramie Project. They actually talked to people. And one of the things that we were talking about, which I found really interesting, was that I had pulled up something on the internet that over the last night or yesterday, the Atlanta Police Department had arrested some suspects in an anti-gay beating, which was all over. It went viral. And I sort of said to Greg, you know, how I guess we've come a little ways, but how far have we come? Because Matthew Shepard's beating wasn't filmed, but now we're, you know, it's kind of the same thing years later, but it's all over the internet. So, and interestingly enough, Greg is going to tell us about this because this is the fascinating part. You went to Laramie and you talked to people, and so start with that. Tell us like what this experience was like.
Well, I've sort of created, as a director in Chicago for the past 15 years, I've sort of created a niche of doing real life shows. I've done several of these. I did Patient A, which was about Kimberly Bergalis, the controversial woman who contracted AIDS from her dentist. Piece of My Heart, which was about women who were in Vietnam. Crime of the Century, which was about the Richard Speck murders, and a few years ago, Columbinus, which was about the Columbine shootings. And I'm very drawn to these true life shows because you have the opportunity to do the research and actually meet these people. And every show I do, I've been very lucky to get to meet a lot of the people who are involved or the subjects of the story. I think I found that once they realize you're taking the time to talk to them because you want to learn and tell the story right and not for sensationalistic value, they're very, very open to talking to you. So Laramie Project is a script that I discovered 12 years ago. I discovered the script before anybody had heard of it. I had read something about it, got the script, it was just opening, so nobody knew anything about it, and I immediately knew this was a show that I wanted to do someday, and it's taken 12 years, but here we are. And one of the reasons that I was drawn to it was because it was a true story, and it was such a, you know, the Matthew Shepard beating was kind of a seminal event in the history of the world that really forced people to really take a look at their own hatred and take a look at a very, very hard look at intolerance and acceptance. And no place was it more true than in Laramie. And the interesting thing about Laramie Project is it's almost more about how the town dealt with it themselves and how they were forced to look at themselves than it is the actual crime. So because of that, I felt it was imperative that I talk to these people. And you know, when I told some people that I'm going out to Laramie, one of my friends said, well, of course you are. You know, that's what you do. It's what you do. So I did it on relatively short notice, but went out there, and there is the Matthew Shepard Foundation, which Matthew's mother Judy founded and does obviously a lot of good. They've had so many requests over the years with help with the Laramie Project that they actually have created a position that only deals with Laramie Project requests. And her name is Susan Burke, who actually went to Goodman here at DePaul, so there was a Chicago connection. So I started out with her, and she pointed me in a lot of different directions and people to get in touch with. So I went out there about 5 weeks ago. It was the weekend that we started rehearsals, and it was pretty amazing how fast everything flew together. You know, I mean, once everybody was just very willing to talk with me. I talked with Dave OMalley, who was the lead investigator of the Matthew Shepard case. I talked with Rulon Stacy, who was the CEO of Poudre Valley Hospital, which is actually in Fort Collins, Colorado, where Matthew was taken because they didn't have the trauma facilities in Laramie to deal with the extent of his injuries. And he was the one who made the updates constantly, the medical updates to national TV, and there's quite a moment that happened to him where he actually broke down on TV as he announced that Matthew had died. I spoke with Jim Osborne, who was a friend of Matthew Shepard's. I spoke with Kathy Connolly, who's a teacher at the University of Wyoming, but was also the first openly gay member of Congress to be elected in Wyoming. And I ended up, just by sheer coincidence, talking to the judge, who was the judge in Russell Henderson's trial, who was one of the two murderers. So they were all very open. It was fascinating to talk with them, and I've since talked to several people over the phone that I was not able to meet in Laramie. Just 3 days ago, I spoke with Reggie Flutie, who was a major character in the show, and she was the officer who was the first out to the scene and was the first to find Matthew tied to the fence. You know, she was the first one to see him. So it was quite an amazing
This is so unusual for a director who really researches his topic. I mean, some research it by just reading up on it. You actually go there and...
Well, I just feel it's my job. You know, I think I mean, and all these conversations that I've had with these people have been absolutely invaluable throughout the rehearsal process. And several of the cast members have taken it upon themselves to talk to them themselves. Everyone I talk to has said, sure, if any of your cast members want to talk to me, feel free to, you know, here's my number, have them call me. So we've had cast members who have done that as well.
Is it true that, I think it was with Laramie that they had come back years later, somebody on TV had done an interview, and some of the ways that people had felt then, they don't necessarily feel now, they've changed some of their thinking?
Well, Dave OMalley is the perfect example of that, and that's dealt with quite a bit in 10 Years Later, which is the follow-up, which we're doing both shows. We're doing Laramie and 10 Years Later. And Dave, as I said, was the lead investigator in the case, and he told me this in person, and that, you know, he was very homophobic. He was the one who made the jokes in the locker room, and he said this case just completely changed the way he looked at it. And now he's an advocate for tolerance and acceptance, and it's changed a lot of people. Some people it hasn't, which is another interesting angle that they discovered when 10 years later, they went back out. Tectonic went out 10 years later for the 10th anniversary and basically wrote, I don't want to call it a sequel because it's not a sequel, they call it an epilogue. But they basically wrote, you know, they went out to explore how Laramie has changed. And a lot of people have changed, and surprisingly, some people haven't.
And I want to say on a personal note, and I don't do this very often, but I grew up in an environment where everything was accepted. My mother, you know, taught me to accept everything. And we all know that, you know, hatred comes out of, you know, not knowing certain people. If you don't know gay people, or you don't know black, or you don't know certain, you know, groups, you know, you develop this hatred. And it's interesting because I guess in some ways when I read this article, I thought, oh, people don't do these kind of things anymore. They don't beat people up because they're homosexuals or they're this or they're that. And they do. And so this still exists. And I guess in my world, I don't see it, but it's out there and it exists. And that's kind of scary that it still exists. So it's interesting because, like you said, some people have changed their thinking, but some probably feel exactly like they did in 1998. And
well, it's interesting. I always say, and I use this as a, you know, we've talked about this a lot in rehearsals. When you grow up in Chicago or New York City or LA, most big cities are very, very liberal. So you tend to think that the entire country is like that.
Right.
But the truth is the big cities are 1/10 of this country. And about 3 years ago, for vacation, I went out on a road trip through North and South Dakota, and Wyoming's the first time I went to Wyoming, and Montana and Colorado. And I got out there and realized the city of 10 million that I live in is a small microcosm of what most of the country is. So we forget, because we're brought up here and we grew up here and we live in these enormous cities, and it's a very, very liberal city, that the rest of the country isn't like us. We're actually the minority in a lot of ways.
I'm glad I live in Chicago.
People need to get in their car and actually drive. I mean, you just go 100 miles away from Chicago and it's completely different. You know, it's very rural, and rural thinking is a lot different than some of the big city thinking is.
Right. Well, the interesting thing about Laramie, that like I said, I was out there about 3 years ago, just overnight, but spending more time out there, and it really hit me that, you know, you think of Laramie as an enormous city. That's because there's 3 large cities in Wyoming. Laramie is the biggest city. Laramie is a population of 30,000. I live in Downers Grove, which is a population of 150,000. We're considered a suburb, whereas Laramie is has 1/6 the population of the suburb I live in. So you just have to really get in that mindset of you can literally drive across the city of Laramie in 10 minutes. So
Now,
it's very interesting.
Now, you just said you went there 3 years ago, so you've been working on this for a while then?
Well, actually, when I was out there 3 years ago, it was just one stop in my road trip, but I was like, I purposely stayed an overnight because of the interest of Laramie Project. And I actually went to what was the Fireside Bar, which was where Matthew Shepard was picked up by Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson that night. It was no longer the Fireside Bar, and now it's completely closed. I mean, they've had, for various reasons, part of which it's the bar where Matthew Shepard was essentially kidnapped and beaten that night. They've never really recovered from that. So the purpose of that trip wasn't for the research, but I purposely stayed in Laramie because I was interested in seeing the town because of the show. So I mean, this show's been on my radar for 10 years. I've been preparing for this show for 10 years.
This is a world premiere in Chicago, right? I mean, a Chicago premiere.
10 years later, not Laramie Project. Laramie Project
I wanted to talk about that because there's 3 components to this.
Right.
And first of all, they're having a benefit. There's a benefit night on March 10th, the Laramie Project 10 years later.
Right.
And that is, Red Twist is doing a benefit for the Matthew Shepard Foundation. Is that the one you said that his mother will be
Judy
at?
Shepard is going to be in for that, which is pretty
Judy
exciting.
Shepard will be in for that. Okay,
Right.
that's very cool. Then you're doing stage readings. Now talk a little bit about the stage readings because these are not your typical stage readings.
Right. Well, the centerpiece of the project is 10 years later, is the Chicago premiere of 10 years later, is a follow-up because that's never been seen in Chicago. The script is only 2 years old, so that's the centerpiece. But it's always, when I saw the reading of, the world premiere reading of 10 Years Later, about a little over 2 years ago at the Goodman Theater, and it was performed simultaneously at 150 theaters around the country at the very same time. It was the 11th anniversary of Matthew's death. And that's when I realized these shows have got to be done together. So when I approached Red Twist with the project, we talked about ways to do that. And as I said, the centerpiece is 10 Years Later, is the Chicago premiere of the epilogue. But I also felt it was very important for the people who are not familiar with Laramie Project or wanted to reacquaint themselves with it to somehow have that opportunity to do that. So I suggested we do this series of readings, staged readings, and I use staged in quotes because it's much more than a staged reading. A lot of readings, when you hear the word readings, you think of just a one-time reading done under work lights just to hear the script and with very little rehearsal. We're doing a very extensive, we're 10 rehearsals, 10 or 12 rehearsals for this. There's full design elements, there's lighting, there's costume pieces. It's not just sitting, there's some staging to it. So we're putting a lot of effort into it. It's, we're presenting it as a production. The only difference is they will have their scripts in hands because the focus, again, really is 10 years later.
And thank you all because just like, as always, we're running out of time. Devlin did some great shows for us. I was going to talk about some shows that are coming that you haven't seen because of your young age. One is on its 40th anniversary. Gail, thanks for putting this all together for me and keeping me in line. From Chicago Theater Review, I'm Frank and Gail, and we will see you at the theater.
Thank you.